It was one of the most heartbreaking tragedies to ever strike the hill country of eastern Kentucky, and for nearly 70 years, it has been almost entirely forgotten. This is the incredible true story of the Holcomb family. Our story begins in the rugged hollows of Perry County, Kentucky, in a narrow valley carved out by Buckhorn Creek, where the ridge lines rise so steep on either side that folks used to say the sun didn't reach the valley floor till nearly 9 in the morning, even in the middle of summer. This land had been logged hard in the early part of the century, the big stands of poplar and oak hauled out by rail to mills further down the valley, and what was left behind, by the 1930s, was a scattering of small farming families making do on steep rocky ground that the timber companies hadn't wanted in the first place. It was hard country, but it was home country, and the families who'd settled there had mostly been there 2 and 3 generations deep, tied together by blood and by church and by the simple fact that there was nowhere else most of them had ever known. Among those families was Garland Holcomb, who farmed a steep 40 acres along Buckhorn Creek in a 4-room house his own father had built. Garland was, by every account that survives him, a quiet, hard-working man. The kind who didn't say much, but who you could count on, whether it was helping a neighbor get a barn raised or sitting up all night with a sick mule. He'd married a woman named Pearl a few years before, a schoolteacher's daughter from over in Hazard, who'd given up a chance at more schooling herself to marry a farmer and raise a family in the hollows, and by all accounts never once seemed to regret it. By the autumn of 1939, Garland and Pearl had 5 children. The oldest, a boy named Otis, was 11, and the youngest, a girl they called Junie, wasn't yet 2. Daily life for the Holcombs, like every family along that creek, was a steady rhythm of work that never really stopped. Garland was up before light every morning, tending the stock, working the fields when the weather allowed it, and in the fall, like most of the men in that hollow, picking up extra work where he could find it, and in 1939, the work that was available, the work that paid real cash money instead of just trade, was coal. A new drift mine had opened up the ridge from the Holcomb place 2 years before, run by a small independent operator, and Garland, like a dozen other men from up and down Buckhorn Creek, had taken on shift work there to bring in money the farm alone couldn't provide. It wasn't easy money. Drift mining in those hollows in 1939 was dangerous, poorly regulated work, done with pick and shovel and dynamite in seams sometimes barely 4 feet high, lit by carbide lamps, with timbering that depended entirely on how careful or how rushed the crew happened to be that day. Pearl, for her part, kept the house and the children and the garden that fed them through the winter, and by every surviving account from neighbors who remembered her decades later, she was the kind of woman who never seemed to slow down, up before her husband most mornings to get the wood stove going. The kind of mother who made sure every one of her 5 children, however little money there was, had a clean shirt for church on Sunday. The Holcombs were members of the small Buckhorn Creek Baptist congregation, a 1-room frame church about a mile down the valley, and Sunday service was, for that whole community, as much a social gathering as a religious one, a chance to see neighbors, trade news, and for the children especially, a rare break from the endless chores of hollow life. It was a Tuesday in late October of 1939 when Garland went in for what should have been an ordinary second shift at the drift mine. The morning had started unremarkably, Pearl recalled, in an account she gave decades later to a relative who recorded it, that Garland had eaten his breakfast quietly, the way he always did, kissed each of the children on the head before he left, the way he always did, and walked the 1.5 miles up the ridge to the mine entrance, same as he had nearly every working day for 2 years. What nobody in that valley knew that morning, what nobody could have known, was that a section of the mine roughly 600 feet back from the entrance had developed a slow methane buildup over the preceding several days. The kind of buildup that, in a properly ventilated, properly inspected operation, would have been caught and cleared before it ever became dangerous. This was not, by the surviving accounts and by the brief state inspection report filed afterward, a properly ventilated, properly inspected operation. The mine's ventilation system, according to that report, consisted of little more than a single auxiliary fan positioned near the entrance, entirely inadequate for a working face 600 feet back into the mountain and the mine's owner. In the report's own carefully restrained bureaucratic language, had not engaged a certified inspection in the 11 months preceding the incident, in apparent violation of state code. At approximately 2:40 in the afternoon, a spark from a pick-striking rock at the working face ignited the accumulated gas. The explosion that followed tore through the mine's main working section with a force that, according to survivors who were further back in the tunnel and managed to escape, knocked men off their feet nearly 200 feet from the point of ignition. 12 men were working the affected section that afternoon. Garland Holcomb was one of them. Before we go any further, if stories like this one matter to you, the ones that get buried under decades of silence until almost nobody remembers them, stick around, because what happened to the Holcomb family in the days that followed is, in its own way, just as remarkable as the tragedy itself. And if you've got a story like this one from your own family's history, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Word of the explosion reached Pearl Holcomb within the hour, carried down the valley by a neighbor boy running barefoot the whole 1.5 miles from the mine entrance to the Holcomb house, too out of breath at first to say much more than the mine and Garland. By the time Pearl reached the mine entrance herself, half carrying little Junie on her hip with the other 4 children trailing behind her, a crowd had already gathered, wives, mothers, children, the whole hollow converging on that single dirt road leading up to the drift entrance, waiting in the cold autumn air for word. The rescue efforts that followed were, like the mine's safety record itself, hampered badly by the limited resources available to a small, rural, independent operation. The nearest organized mine rescue team, equipped with proper breathing apparatus for re-entering a gas-filled mine, was based more than 40 miles away, and accounts from survivors describe a desperate, agonizing wait of nearly 5 hours before that team arrived, during which the only rescue efforts possible were a handful of miners from neighboring operations, men who'd rushed over the ridge on foot or horseback the moment word reached them, attempting partial re-entries without proper equipment, pulling out what survivors they could reach near the entrance, while the deeper sections of the mine remained, for those agonizing hours, completely inaccessible. Of the 12 men working the affected section, 4 were pulled out alive in those first chaotic hours, suffering from severe burns and smoke inhalation, but alive. 3 bodies were recovered before nightfall. The remaining 5 men, including Garland Holcomb, were trapped behind a section of collapsed roof nearly 300 feet back from the entrance, in a section the arriving rescue team, even with proper equipment, could not safely reach until well past midnight, working by carbide lamp and lantern light through rubble that threatened further collapse with every piece they cleared. One of the 4 men pulled out alive that afternoon was a young miner named Cletus Adkins, 23 years old at the time, who had been working a section of the mine closer to the entrance and had managed, badly burned but conscious, to crawl nearly 100 feet toward the surface before rescuers reached him. Adkins lived another 51 years after that day, and in 1987, near the end of his life, gave an extended oral history interview to a regional folklife project documenting the area's mining heritage. An interview that survives today as one of the only detailed first-hand accounts of what that afternoon actually felt like from inside the mine. Adkins described the moment of the explosion itself in terms that researchers studying mining disasters of this era have noted as remarkably consistent with other survivor accounts from similar incidents. A sound he described as less like an explosion and more like the whole mountain taking a breath and then letting it out all at once, followed by a wall of pressure and heat that knocked him flat before he'd even had time to understand what was happening. He recalled, in the same interview, the desperate scramble of the men nearest the entrance to get out and the agonizing, helpless feeling of knowing that men further back, men he knew personally, men whose families he'd see at church the following Sunday whether they made it out or not, were trapped behind a section of roof that nobody near the entrance had any way to clear without proper equipment and more hands than were available in those first critical hours. You knew who was back there, Atkins said, in a passage from the interview that the Folklife Project later published in a regional history journal. Wasn't strangers, was Garland, was Thomas Fougat, was the Caudill boy who couldn't have been more than 19. You're standing there at that entrance not able to do a thing but wait on help that's 40 miles off. And you're listening to wives and mothers start gathering on that road. And there's nothing. Nothing at all. You can tell them. That helps. Adkins also offered, in that same interview, a detail about the mine's safety conditions that corroborates and expands on the state inspection report's findings. Describing a working environment where complaints about gas buildup and inadequate ventilation had been raised informally by several miners, including, by his account, Garland Holcomb himself, in the weeks before the explosion. Complaints that, according to Adkins, were met by the mine's foreman with assurances that had been checked and it was fine, assurances that, in light of what happened, Adkins said he'd spent the rest of his life unable to fully forgive. Pearl Holcomb, by every account from neighbors who stayed with her through that long night, did not leave the mine entrance for the better part of 14 hours. Sitting on an overturned crate with little Junie wrapped in a blanket against the October cold, her other 4 children gathered close around her, watching the entrance for any sign of word. A neighbor woman, interviewed decades later by a local historian, recalled that Pearl said almost nothing through the entire ordeal, just sat there, straight-backed, like she was holding the whole world up by sitting up straight enough. The rescue team finally reached the trapped section of the mine a few minutes past 1 in the morning. All 5 men, including Garland Holcomb, were found together, and according to the report filed by the rescue team's leader, appeared to have survived the initial explosion and roof collapse, only to succumb in the hours that followed to the buildup of toxic gas in the sealed section where they'd been trapped, with no way out and no way for help to reach them in time. Garland Holcomb was 34 years old. He left behind Pearl and 5 children, the youngest of whom, Junie, was not yet 2 years old and would grow up with no memory of her father at all beyond the stories her older siblings would tell her. The funeral, held 3 days later at the small Buckhorn Creek Baptist Church, drew mourners from up and down the entire valley. Garland was buried alongside 2 of the other miners who died with him, in a section of the small church cemetery that, within a few years, would come to be known locally simply as the Miners' Row, as more men from that same mine, and others like it scattered through those hollows, would eventually be laid to rest nearby in the years that followed. What happened to Pearl Holcomb and her 5 children in the months and years after that October afternoon is, in many ways, the part of this story that has stayed with researchers and local historians the longest, because it reflects something true about an entire era and an entire region, not just one family's particular grief. There was, in 1939, no workers' compensation system covering mine fatalities of this kind in any meaningful way for a small, independent, poorly regulated operation like the one that had employed Garland. No insurance payout, no pension. Nothing beyond what the mine owner himself chose, voluntarily, to offer, which according to surviving correspondence between Pearl and a relative, amounted to a single payment of $40, characterized in the mine owner's own letter as an expression of sympathy for your loss, and nothing further. Pearl Holcomb was left, at 31 years old, a widow with 5 children and 40 rocky acres that, without a husband to work them, represented far more labor than one woman alone could realistically manage. What she did next is recorded, in fragments, across a handful of surviving family letters, a brief 1962 interview she gave to a county newspaper on the occasion of a mining safety retrospective piece, and the oral history passed down through her surviving descendants, several of whom still live in that same county today. Pearl did not leave the valley, the way some widows in her position did, moving to relatives in a larger town where work might be easier to find. She stayed, and she farmed those 40 acres herself, with the help of her oldest son Otis, who was 11 at the time of his father's death, and who, by his own account given decades later, stopped being a boy that October and started being the man of the house, whether I was ready for it or not. Otis took on his father's share of the farm work at an age when most boys were still mainly in school, and according to family accounts, never finished beyond the 6th grade himself, his education sacrificed to the practical necessity of keeping his mother and 4 younger siblings fed. Pearl also took in washing and mending for other families in the valley who could afford to pay a little for it, and during the Second World War, when so much of the country's able-bodied workforce was overseas, she found steady work for several years at a small textile operation that had set up in the nearest town, walking the 4 miles each way on the days she could get someone to watch Junie and her younger brother. By every account that survives, she never remarried, devoting the rest of her working life entirely to raising her 5 children and, eventually, to helping raise a number of her grandchildren as well. All 5 Holcomb children survived to adulthood, a fact that, given the realities of rural poverty in that era, was itself not something to be taken for granted. Otis took over the family farm fully by the time he was in his 20s, and farmed that same land, by his children's account, until his own death in 1994. Junie, the baby who'd been wrapped in a blanket at the mine entrance that long October night, grew up, married, and eventually moved to Lexington, where she worked for over 30 years as a hospital administrator, and where, according to a 2009 interview she gave to a graduate researcher studying coal mining disasters in the region, she kept a single photograph of her father, the only photograph of him that survives in the family's possession, a formal portrait taken shortly after his marriage to Pearl, on her bedroom dresser for her entire adult life. The other 3 Holcomb children also went on to lives that, while less extensively documented than Otis's and Junie's, are preserved in fragments across census records, church membership rolls, and family recollections passed down to later generations. The second oldest, a daughter named Wilma, married a man from a neighboring hollow at 19 and raised 6 children of her own, several of whom still live in Perry County today. The 2 middle children, twin boys named Cecil and Vernon, both went on to work in coal mining themselves as adults, a detail that several family members interviewed in recent years have described as a source of quiet, complicated anxiety for Pearl throughout their working lives, given how her own husband had died. Both Cecil and Vernon, according to family accounts, survived their mining careers without serious incident and lived into their 70s. The explosion that killed Garland Holcomb and 4 other men was, in the broader context of the region's mining history, neither the first nor the last disaster of its kind to strike the small, poorly regulated independent mines scattered throughout the Kentucky coalfields during this era. But it did. according to local historians who've studied the period, contribute to a renewed, if ultimately limited, push for stronger state mine safety enforcement in the early 1940s. A state mine inspector's report filed in the aftermath specifically cited the Buckhorn Creek explosion, alongside two similar incidents at other small operations the same year, in recommending stricter ventilation and inspection requirements for independent drift mines operating below a certain employee threshold, recommendations that were partially adopted by the state legislature in 1941, though enforcement, by most historical accounts, remained inconsistent for decades afterward. And similar disasters continued to occur at small, under-regulated operations throughout the region well into the 1960s and beyond. The mine itself reopened under new ownership less than a year after the explosion, operating for another 11 years before finally closing in 1950 when the coal seam was exhausted, a detail that, for a community still grieving 5 of its own men, represented both an economic necessity and, for some families including, by at least one surviving account, the Holcombs themselves, a source of real and lasting bitterness. Several of the men who went back to work in that same mine in the years after the explosion, according to local oral history, were the same men, or the sons of the same men, who had helped with the desperate, improvised rescue efforts that October night, a reflection of just how few other options for paid work existed in that valley, even in the immediate shadow of tragedy. In that same 2009 interview, conducted when Junie was in her early 70s, she offered what might be the single most affecting surviving reflection on her family's story. Asked what she remembered of her father, she answered honestly that she remembered nothing at all, being far too young, but that what she carried instead was everything her mother and older siblings had told her over the years, repeated so many times across her childhood that the memories felt, in her words, almost like my own, even though I know they aren't. She described her mother Pearl as a woman who, despite everything, never once let us hear her complain about the hand she'd been dealt, not once in my whole life, though I know now, looking back, just how much she must have had to carry. Pearl Holcomb died in 1981, at the age of 73, having outlived her husband by 42 years, and having raised, largely on her own, 5 children who themselves went on to raise families of their own across 3 more generations. She is buried at Buckhorn Creek Baptist Church, not far from the Miners' Row, where Garland and his fellow miners were laid to rest more than 4 decades before her. I wanted to see what remained of this story for myself. So, on a clear morning this past fall, I made the drive out to that same valley in Perry County, following directions an elderly cousin of the family, tracked down through a genealogy forum, had been kind enough to give me over the phone. We're out here now in what's left of Buckhorn Hollow, and I have to say, it's about as quiet and as beautiful a piece of country as you'll find anywhere in eastern Kentucky. The old mine itself is long gone, sealed up decades ago, and from what locals tell me, the entrance collapsed entirely sometime in the 1970s, so there's really nothing left to mark exactly where it was, beyond a rough clearing on the hillside that old-timers in the area can still point you toward if you ask the right person. I did stop by the little church just down the road, Buckhorn Creek Baptist, which is still standing, still an active congregation after all these years, and the woman who keeps the grounds was kind enough to walk me back to the cemetery. And there it is, the Miners' Row, Garland Holcomb, right here, 1905 to 1939. And just down from him, 2 of the other men who died alongside him that same afternoon. The stones are simple, worn down some by the weather, but somebody's clearly been keeping the grass trimmed back here, even all these decades later. The woman from the church told me a few of Garland's great-grandchildren still live in the county and come by from time to time, I think that matters more than almost anything else in this story, that somebody's still tending it. Before I left, I had the chance to speak briefly by phone with one of Garland's great-grandchildren, a woman named Karen, who still lives about 20 minutes from the old home place, and who'd been the one to pass along directions to the cemetery through that genealogy forum I mentioned earlier. Karen told me that growing up, the story of Garland and Pearl was something her own grandmother, Junie, the baby from that night, talked about often, not as a tragedy exactly. Though, of course, it was one, but more as a kind of family touchstone, a reminder of where their resilience came from. Grandma Junie used to say that whenever any of us thought we had it hard, Karen told me, she'd remind us that her mother buried a husband at 31 with 5 kids and 40 rocky acres, and never once asked anybody for pity. She'd say if Pearl could do that, the rest of us could handle whatever we were complaining about that day. Karen also mentioned that the family still holds a small reunion every other summer, usually at a park not far from the old home place, and that for the past several years, someone has made a point of bringing the old photograph, the one of Garland, the only one that survives, so that the younger generations, now 5 and 6 generations removed from that October afternoon, can see his face at least once. It's not much, she said, but it's something. It means he's not just a name on a stone to us. He's still somebody's people. It's worth pausing on one more family touched by that October afternoon, because the Holcombs, devastating as their loss was, were not the only ones left to rebuild in the wake of that explosion. The Caudle boy that Cletus Adkins mentioned in his 1987 interview, the one Adkins described as couldn't have been more than 19, was a young man named Roy Caudle, the second youngest of 8 children, who had only started working at the mine 4 months before the explosion, taking the job specifically to help his family save toward a small piece of bottomland his father had his eye on a few miles further down the valley. Roy Caudle's death left his own mother, a widow herself by that point, with 7 remaining children and considerably less means than Pearl Holcomb had, given that Roy had been her primary source of outside income. Local church records from Buckhorn Creek Baptist show that the congregation took up a special collection for the Caudle family in the weeks following the explosion. A gesture repeated, according to the same records, for each of the 5 families affected, reflecting a community response that, however limited it could be, given how little anyone in that hollow actually had to give, represented real and sustained mutual support in the disaster's aftermath. Pearl Holcomb herself, according to a brief mention in a later family letter, was among those who contributed what little she could to the collection for the Caudle family, despite her own circumstances being, by that point, scarcely better than theirs. This pattern of mutual aid, repeated across dozens of similar small mining disasters throughout the region during this era, reflects something that local historians studying Appalachian coal communities have noted as a defining, if often overlooked, feature of how these hollows actually functioned in practice. In the near-total absence of any meaningful institutional safety net, communities built their own, informal as it was, sustained by church collections, shared labor, and an unspoken but deeply held expectation that no family facing this kind of loss would be left to face it entirely alone. It is a part of this story easy to overlook next to the more dramatic facts of the explosion itself, but it may be, in its own quiet way, just as essential to understanding how families like the Holcombs and the Caudles actually survived what should, by any reasonable measure, have been an unsurvivable blow. I'll leave you with this. When I started researching the Holcomb family, I expected to find a story about a mining disaster, and in part, that's exactly what it is. But the longer I sat with it, the more I came to understand that the real story here isn't really about that one October afternoon at all. It's about everything that came after. About a 31-year-old widow with 5 children and 40 rocky acres who simply refused to let her family come apart, who raised every one of those children to adulthood on sheer determination and very little else, and who, by every account anyone who knew her has ever given, never once let them see her break. Garland Holcomb's death was a tragedy. But Pearl Holcomb's life, the 4 decades she spent afterward quietly, stubbornly keeping her family together against odds that would have broken plenty of people, that, to me, might be the part of this story that most deserves to be remembered. Thanks so much for watching. If this story moved you, stick around for more. There are forgotten stories like this one scattered all across these mountains, and I'd be glad to have you along as we find the next one.